Hello everyone, I'm back here again today to read you another book that has to do with heredity. We have been talking about heredity and the passing down of genes from one generation to the next, from parents to offspring, and we've learned that all living things inherit traits from their parents. This includes plants. So today we're going to be reading a book that talks about a little bit more about Gregor Mendel, the father of heredity or the father of genetics, and some of the work that he did with the pea plant and some of his other research. And remember, yesterday we did the Punnett squares, and it was Gregor Mendel that found that traits could be dominant, that dominant traits in the pea plant were the tall traits, the tall genes, or more specifically, the allele that basically acts as the variation in the trait, in the gene, that can be inherited. So remember that the dominant gene, the tall pea plants, grew on average 3 out of 4 times. Please remember that during the first generation of the pea plant study that Gregor Mendel carried out, only tall pea plants grew. But then in the second generation, because all those tall pea plants from the first generation, even since they carried the short allele too, it was possible 1 out of 4, think of the lowercase t, like we did the Punnett squares, 1 out of 4 in that bottom right corner, we learned that the blue eyes could come out, and that's the same as the short gene of the pea plants coming out. All right, so today I'm going to be reading you a book with sort of a funny title. It's called I Got It From My Mama, and its subtitle is Gregor Mendel Explains Heredity. All right, here we go. Why do kids so often look like their parents? And why do they sometimes look different? How people, animals, and plants inherit their traits is a mystery that Gregor Mendel helped to solve. Let's find out how. The mystery of heredity. For centuries, farmers have known that, in general, if you have a plant and use seeds from it, the resulting plants will look and act much like the plant you got the seeds from and the plant that fertilized the seeds. That's why farmers try to combine the best plants so they can improve the harvest in future years. In plants, farmers use what's called gene selection. They select the seeds from the strongest plants to have crops with better features and healthier features. They have also known that if you cross-fertilize plants with a related plant, one result may be a stronger and more productive plant. However, nobody really understood how this worked or how you could predict results. Here is a bee pollinating a flower. Gregor Mendel lived in Moravia, now part of the Czech Republic, from 1822 to 1884. He was a monk and a scientist and worked to understand the process by which offspring inherit traits from their parents. His studies laid the groundwork for understanding genetics and heredity. Here's a picture of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel at work. As a young man, Mendel worked on the family farm tending bees and gardening. He often had to interrupt his studies because of illness and poverty. He became a monk partly so that he could complete his education for free. He taught his high school and did research on top of his religious duties. He was not a great student, and he did not perform very well in exams, but he still went on to make many discoveries as a result of patient work over many years. We've been talking about the importance of patience through your work and having a growth mindset. And by the way, a monk is like a religious leader, similar to a priest or a rabbi. Mendel published papers on bees and astronomy and meteorology, and most of his surviving published papers are about weather patterns. Several of Mendel's teachers were conducting studies in animal development and encouraged Mendel to look at how traits are handed on from generation to generation. Mendel concentrated on plants instead of animals and got the use of several acres of an experimental farm for his work. Now, it's important that Gregor Mendel focused on plants and not animals. This is a bunch of bees, by the way, because plants, the generation is able to grow more quickly. So because he was studying plants, he was able to see another generation of plants very quickly compared to animals that you need to wait time to see the next generation because it takes longer for animals to grow and reproduce. Experiments with pea plants. Mendel decided to work with pea plants because he could grow 2 generations each year. This would make it easier to collect data about how traits are passed on than it is when working with animals, whose period between their birth and when they can have their own children is longer, often much longer. So there were 7 characteristics of the pea plant he looked at: the seed, the flower, the pad, the stem, and there were actually 2 characteristics of the seed he looked at, 1 for the flower, 2 for the pad, which were the form of the pad and the color of the pad, and then the place of the stem and the size of the stem. Here is a chart that's difficult to see, I know. Mendel also studied bees and mice, but his superior in the religious order did not like his research using animals. Also, the bees were very aggressive and kept stinging the other monks, so Mendel, who was very fond of the bees, had to get rid of them. Picture of a mouse, which Gregor Mendel liked to work with. There were a number of traits in pea plants that seemed to Mendel to be worth looking at. He wanted to see how the offspring inherited the parents' plant's height, the seed shape, the seed color, flower location, pod shape, the color of the unripe pod, and the flower location. He started with seed shape, which was either round or angular. Here's a green pea plant. From 1856 to 1863, Mendel grew and studied about 28,000 plants. So 28,000 plants over a 7 or 8 year period. He began to understand the nature of dominant and recessive inheritance. Here is another picture of Gregor Mendel. We heard the word dominant and recessive. Remember, dominant means strong, recessive means weak. Dominant and recessive. Neither Mendel nor anybody else at the time understood all the details of how cells pass on their features. He did not know what we now know about genes and DNA, but he could observe among his peas that there was a pattern in the way traits are passed on. So Gregor Mendel was a bit ahead of his time in studying genetics, because they didn't know about DNA or genes or things like that. So Gregor Mendel was the reason we call him the father of genetics, is because he sort of started this. He laid the groundwork for future scientists. Just 150 years ago, 170 years ago, they did not know as much, as not even nearly close to as much as we know now. Remember that each offspring gets traits from both parents. In the case of a plant, from the parent that fertilizes the seed and the parent where the seed actually grows. So we learned about the pollen from one plant, pollinating the pistil of the other plant. Let's make up a plant that has a trait that the leaves will be either round or pointy. The new plant gets one instruction about leaf shape from one parent and another from another parent. So the new plant could get any one of 3 instruction pairs. It can get the round and round, it can get round and pointy, or it can get pointy and pointy. Those are the 3 combinations. It's pretty clear that if the new plant gets an RR instruction, its leaves will tend to be round. And if it gets a P plus P combination of instruction, its leaves will tend to be pointy. But what happens to the new plants that get a mixed R plus P instruction? If you found that the new plants with R plus P tended to grow rounded leaves, you would say that the R instruction is dominant and the P instruction is recessive. If the new plants tended to grow pointy leaves, you would say that the P was the dominant instruction and R was recessive, like we learned yesterday with brown being dominant over blue. Because 80% of the world has brown eyes, and if you receive the brown and the blue allele, you would be receiving brown eyes. Even though you have both alleles, brown takes control. It is dominant over the blue. Remember that inheritance is not like a light switch which either goes on or off. A lot more goes into inheriting traits than this simple example can illustrate, but this is the start of understanding what Mendel discovered. His 3 discoveries were the law of segregation, the law of independent assortment, and the law of dominance. Okay, we are going to stop here for today because this is going to get into some deeper information that I will continue reading to you next time. And I think that that's a long enough time for the read aloud today. So just remember, the important things to take away still remain that there are dominant and recessive genes that you receive. In the case of eye color, brown dominates over the others, but that does not mean it's impossible to get blue or hazel or green. You would still have a 1 in 4 chance if your parents carry both brown and blue. Like the first Punnett square we did yesterday, both parents had a brown and a blue. It's possible for both parents to have brown, 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 brown. Then you'd 100% get brown eyes. It would be impossible for you to get anything else. All right, so dominant and recessive. And new information today is that it was important for Gregor Mendel to work with plants because the generations can move along more quickly. He could go through 2 generations a year. When animals, it would take much longer, so his research would have taken longer and been more difficult to do. All right, I hope you enjoyed this read aloud, and I will see you next time.